Hello and welcome to the Awakening Report. I'm your host, Doug Hamp. Excited to be with you again. We are going to look at some amazing things. We have Chris Steinle back with us today. We just had such a great time last time. I invited him to come back, and he's going to share with us another book that he's written. This guy is just a fountain of information. This one is an amazing topic. Well, Chris, let's just be honest. You are. And by the way, hello, welcome to the Awakening Report.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me back on. It's going to be fun. Really enjoyed it both times before.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you coming on. And, you have such a scholarly and yet gentle way of sharing things. I really appreciate that. For me, it's always, where is the text that says such and such? And I appreciate the fact that you do a very thorough job of showing where in the text or where it isn't in the text concerning for certain doctrines. I know we had a lot of views for the one that we did there on the rapture, and you showing that the word harpazo is not technically in the Greek. My goodness, right. That was shaking up a lot of apple carts. Well, today, Chris, we're looking at the question that you have raised of the rise of Western lawlessness. And I'll tell you, as I was going over your book, I mean, I was just like, wow, this is juicy. This is good stuff.
It really is.
But you're gonna have to bring us up to speed. I mean, what do you mean Western lawlessness? I mean, are you saying that we're all just a bunch of lawless people, or is there something bigger? I mean, we do a decent job. We have law and order. We have our courts. What is it that you're actually suggesting?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what caught my attention, I guess, when I was looking at law and order and lawlessness and our leaders even and our ways, our morality, even a lot of our churches turning away from law and other secular sources saying this is lawlessness. And so I studied that, and I noticed that first they came out with the T-shirts, no fear, and then it was no rules, and then there were all the television shows and cartoons that showed no consequences, and now we finally thrown up the flag and said no authority. We don't want the authority figure at all. Get those men in blue out of here. We don't want any of that. We want to express ourselves freely. And anything that inhibits that is fundamentally wrong in today's mind. And so I was looking at where in the world did that come from. And I grew up in one of these 19th century Christian cult religions. And so there was a lot of metaphysics involved in that.
Uh-huh.
And so I've known about the problem of dualism and Docetism and metaphysics for a long time. In fact, I had to come out of that. The Lord pulled me out of that to come to faith in Jesus.
Could you define what metaphysics is, and in your opinion, what is wrong with metaphysics?
Yes, and that's a good place to start. Let me, if I might, before we jump into that, kind of give people an overview of what's in the book. I know you've looked at the book and at least looked through the table of contents, and you looked at some passages. I don't know. I read something the other day on Twitter I thought was fantastic. He said he was a prolific reader of the first half of books. I thought, man, that's just about all of us. We can pick something up and really get into it and kind of chug down. Yeah. And okay, I see where they're going. I got it from here.
Yeah,
I'm going to finish that book someday. Mm-hmm. But anyway, the way the book is presented is it's presented as history, 3,000-year history of Western culture, but it looks at certain subjects, and it looks at creation versus evolution, and obviously evolution, the idea of evolving, and not only that, but the duration of the age. There's a real problem with the way people think about the duration of the age. Today it's like, okay, you don't want to follow God's kingdom, you've turned away from God's kingdom, so just go have your own kingdom of man, go explore the galaxies, have a nice day. You know, so we don't see that in the Word of God that he ever did that. And so there's this misconception of creation and the duration of the age. That's the way it starts out. And then it goes into the classical philosophies, because that's really where you have to go back to. And maybe then from moving forward from there, I won't move forward from there before we go ahead and discuss metaphysics a little bit, because this is a good place to step off and do that.
And I'm really excited about this topic, and you know, and just kind of just a little minor rabbit trail here. As I was going through your book, and you were talking about the Renaissance was just a return to the classical age,
right?
And it's absolutely true what you're saying, because the rise of the closing of the Western mind, which is a great book that I recently read, and there the author is making the case that during that what we call the Roman Catholic era, if you will, from say 300 to about 1500, somewhere in there,
right,
that they had thrown out the rational reasoning type of questions that the classics were asking, and they were going to just a purely faith, in the sense of this is an edict, it's been decreed, don't you dare disagree with that. So I was like, that's really interesting. So as I was kind of putting these pieces together in my mind, I thought, wow, you've really uncovered something very, very deep here, because you've gone even to a more fundamental position than what this author was saying about what was wrong with the Catholic Church, for example. Where the Western mind closed, where they didn't even think about anything. So the classical authors were actually asking questions they were thinking,
right,
but they took it back to the demiurge. So
right,
that's But please go on. I'm really fascinated, very excited.
All right, just to go back to the very beginning and the first question, I looked at 2 Corinthians 10, 4 through 6, and it's one of my favorite verses, and it talks about these weapons that we have for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments. You see, that has to do with ideologies. That has to do with philosophical systems that are primarily wrong and that actually exalt themselves against Christ. And you see the same thing in Colossians 2:8 there. It says, beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of this world, not according to Christ. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, and I want to bring that up because around the time that I wrote my book, there were a number of other books being written, and they were tracing the problem to secret societies. Now, granted, there are some secret societies, and they're being used by the enemy, but that's not where it started, I don't believe. They're tracing it back to codes, and I don't think it's coding. I think it's much more basic than that. So go back to the very beginning. What you find is there's evidence, because Greece is just to the east a little bit from Israel. And we know also that Israel was scattered, diaspora, and they went all over the place, including Greece. We know that Italy was greatly settled as far as their civilization from Greece as well.
That's right.
Well, it turns out that the classical philosophers were writing, actually Homer was writing several hundreds of years after Moses, knew about Moses, included, many people have observed that he made reference to Moses in his writings. So about the time of what we call classical philosophy, Socrates, Plato, Pythagoras, all these guys began to think about this, and they were disillusioned. They were disenchanted with their marble and metal gods after knowing about the monotheistic God of the Hebrews. They realized, wait a minute, their God's better than our God. But what they did is they created a philosophical God in their mind and reason that has no more life than the marble and stone gods. And so what they did, I'll have to go back to the Republic, where Plato is supposedly recording some conversations that he had with Socrates, and he gives a metaphor of the cave. It's the allegory of the cave, or the analogy of the cave. And he said, imagine that some people were chained and they were facing the back of a cave for all their life, and they saw shadows on the wall, and over time they began to reason that there were real people walking outside the cave, that they just couldn't see them. And so that was to represent the idea that these people, this unseen realm, is what's real, and we're only seeing the shadows, which he even called a half reality. So the philosophical school of realism, which you would think would be talking about, stuff that you can tap on and run into, but no, realism is talking about this fantasy world of realities. Now, Plato called them first principles.
Mm-hmm.
Pythagoras said there was a monad, the one that was at the head of everything. I believe it was the first cause, kind of an idea. Well, you brought up Marcion, and he's my favorite Marcion, by the way. But no, actually, you had Valentinius and some other wackos back there. They all spun off from what happened there in Greece, though, in this dualism. And so what you brought out and what Irenaeus brought out in Marcion, and he went over Valentinius all over the place, just hammered him to pieces. And they strained out the bad dualists, what they called the Gnostics. They let in the good dualists, and I'm going to explain to you how that happened. Because that's really what we need to get to. How did this get into the church? Well, this, and we could go into more of the philosophies of Plato, and I do in later on. When I see in philosophy, there's two main things they're looking at. They're looking at cosmology. They're looking at creation and God and the source of everything. And interestingly enough, they're looking at political science. That's what the thrust of the Republic is all about, is the various forms of government that Plato had lived through. And so both of those conversations popped back up in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And like you say, they picked up rethinking. It was kind of, they had a Wizard of Oz, I say a Wizard of Oz moment at that point. They realized, wait a minute, man has had these good intentions and benevolent intentions to help other people, and this innate goodness all along, but we just didn't know about it. And now all of a sudden we know that we had these things all along. But you're right. It took, in the Renaissance, they weren't coming up with new stuff. They were just going back to what the ancients had already discovered. So what did they discover? They believed that this realm of forms, which they saw as goodness and beauty and justice and virtue and those sort of things, those were the real forms, and everything that is shadowed into this world, so to speak, is defective and less real than those ideal forms. And so this dualism, the idea that there is this place that exists where everything is perfect and good, and then there's this material world. And so there's where the demiurge comes in, and which is really just Greek for the people's worker. He's a self-serving. He serves man. He's what explains why the world was made for man by the first cause, or by the monad. And they don't have a very good explanation. And if you've studied Valentinius, it's so flaky, it's just unbelievable. But basically, interestingly enough, Plato or Socrates, because we really don't know which of them came up with this, said that there were a bunch of somethingnesses, and there were a bunch of nothingnesses, or samenesses and differences, and somehow they got together to form basic shapes like triangles. And then the first cause, or first principle, that's another thing he's called, first principle. That's what he's referred to by by Origen and by Augustine.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, he decided it would really be good if man had a soul. So first of all, he created the world soul. So the demiurge, you got the demiurge, and now the bad Gnostics think that the demiurge is a bad guy. He's dirty because these emanations that fell away from the one, and he got dirty and filthy and messed things up, but there's this nous, there's this divine mind, and that's, you see that all over the ancient world. That I was talking to you about Cicero and the divine mind, the nous. That's where this idea came from. So anyway.
Philo also talked about the nous, right?
Right.
Philo of Alexandria. And some people have suggested that when John was writing about the Logos, that he was actually talking about the nous. I take issue with that. I don't think that it's necessarily the same thing, but it's interesting to.
Here's a big difference. This is huge, and when we move this thing forward, and I'm going to go ahead and do that because we got enough of that as to what dualism is. It's everything that's spiritual is good, basically, in the other realm, the perfect realm, and everything that's material is bad. There's that idea, and so we move that forward with Alexander the Great and conquering the world. And I don't know if people realize to what extent he conquered the world. I'm going to see if I can throw this up here quickly. All right. Can you see that? Are you still there?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, great. This is the Alexandrian Empire, and it goes clear over into India.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happened is he insisted that Greek be spoken throughout his empire, and there began to be this transfer of information back and forth. And so some Eastern mysticism came back over into Alexandria. Let's just go to Alexandria for our purposes there. And I'm going to successfully close this out, I do believe. Yay. All right.
All right, good job.
Hey,
I know sometimes it can be a trick.
I'm getting the hang of this. Okay. Yes. So around, well, it was actually, Philo. Let's go back to Philo, because he picked this up and he started to interpret the Hebrew scriptures using these dualistic principles of good and bad, and mystifying everything. And it so happens that Greece was in control of the Holy Land. In fact, most of the rabbis spoke Greek, and most of the people spoke Greek, and they very rarely used Hebrew, only in synagogue and among the intellectuals, and everybody else was speaking Greek, so it was only natural.
This is in Alexandria.
No, this was in Israel.
Okay, I might take issue with that.
Yeah, well, actually, it's
the opposite, but that's fine.
Yeah, for a time, they brought that in. It was, let's say, okay, let's Galilee, the Galilee area, all right?
All right, I can maybe swallow that.
Yeah, no, that is the case, at least in the Galilean area, and that's one of the reasons it was so rejected by Jerusalem and Judah. Anyway, the next thing we want to go to. Oh, and by the way, you may not be aware of this, but Jerome actually called Philo one of the church fathers.
No,
okay,
I did not know that. That's very interesting.
Yes. So they put so much faith in Philo and in his philosophical system, the Greek philosophical system, that they called him one of the church fathers. And we're going to see that pulled back, and we'll see it pulled in right away.
Let me just bring people up to speed on who Philo is. Philo of Alexandria was more or less a contemporary of Jesus, and he was very interesting that he took the Bible literally on the one hand, and then he took it incredibly allegorically on the other. So he first gave basically a, we'd call a just a literal interpretation. But then he wanted to marry Greek philosophy with the Hebrew Bible. He believed that you could do that using allegory. And so the literal interpretation meant very little to him. He's like, yeah, that's what it says, and that's probably what literally it means, but that's not what it really means, So he's very interesting to study from that sense. And he talks a lot about the nous, about the logos. So he's a very interesting person. Go for it.
All right. A guy by the name of Ammonius Saccas, also in Alexandria, they think that his parents or grandparents were from India and had moved over from that area, and there's some reasons for that. Anyway, contemporary to him is Origen, and they were
so now
even
we're
aware of each other.
Century. We're about the third century.
Yeah, 204 is when Ammonius,
okay.
Saccas.
There's just so many different times and names; it's hard to keep track of everybody. So yeah.
All right. Well, here's how this traces through. There was this guy that wandered into Alexandria, Plotinus, and Plotinus wanted to learn something, and he wasn't satisfied with what he was learning in the Alexandrian schools, and so somebody said, well, you really need to go talk to Ammonius. So he did, and he started learning all of this Greek philosophy and dualism, but in with it were also some Eastern thoughts. And so Origen and Clement of Alexandria and these guys really picked this up and started to incorporate and super spiritualize the scripture now at this point. Well, this guy, Plotinus, and his essays were compiled by a guy named Porphyry, but Plotinus wanted to go to India, and he was on his way to India, and he was going part of a war. I can't remember, Gregorian or something like that, was going that way, and so he was kind of going with the troops. But then something happened. He got stuck in Antioch. So of the center of Christianity, all of a sudden he's stuck there in Antioch for a while. Then he goes back to Alexandria or straight to Rome. We're not sure, but he spends the next 24 years in Rome, and he plugs in with the fat cats in Rome, the rich aristocracy of Rome, and becomes their mentor. And so this he's got what he did is his writings, the Aeneid, the 6 Aeneids that Porphyry compiled from his essays, are the basis of what we call Neoplatonic thought. So when you hear of Neoplatonism, it's really Plotinus through Porphyry that we're getting that. What is it? What does that mean? Well, Aristotle had kind of a down-to-earth, let's plug it in, let's walk it out, let's see what it looks like, let's see what it does for society, and stuff like that. And Plato's heads were in the clouds. You've probably seen the painting with the two of them together. And anyway, that was the way it worked. Well, Plotinus, what he did is he took the Pythagorean monad and he took the good part of Aristotle and the ideology of Plato and mixed them all together into Neoplatonism, and that really became it was received by the church. This is the problem. It was received by the church, and it had dualism, it had asceticism because of the Eastern aspect that the monastic societies, the hermits, and all of these guys, especially in North Africa, got plugged into that. But not only that, you had Carthage, you had Augustine, who wrote about the first principles. He wrote about the first principles, and he broke down the character of man in the three same sectors that Plato had done in the Republic. And
do you believe this is why we find them in the Vatican, on the walls of the Vatican? We find all of these philosophers on the walls of the Vatican.
Oh yeah, I'm sure of it, because what didn't conflict directly with Christianity got brought in, and they used the Neoplatonic thought was used to explain Christianity to the Greek and Roman church.
Okay.
That's basically what they did. They said, you know, let us explain Christianity to you in a way that'll make sense. See, it's all about this good spiritual God. And that's why you had Marcion, and some people say, well, wait a minute, but we got this matter, and matter's bad. And so the guy that created this matter couldn't be good. He's got to be a different God than the God of the Old Testament. And you run into this mess. Well, let me just point out at this point in time what's wrong with even good dualism, okay? Well, the monad, according to Plotinus, the monad was this ethereal being who couldn't do anything, couldn't even be self-aware, couldn't. He was complete, just a concept, basically. Because if he did anything, then there would be like an action-reaction going on, and that would be bad, and that would cause all these emanations and everything to wash out. And so okay, so what it boils down to is it contradicts the living God. That's the problem. It's the God, the philosophical God of goodness, and this creator that instead of the creator of the Bible who made everything and said, behold, it's very good. It's not just good, it's great. And they directly conflict with that, and they have no way of explaining the difference. The other thing that it did, and this is just huge. We could spend an hour on this.
Well, let me just stop you really quick right there. Because, I mean, the God of the Bible is good, and this Greek God is good. So where is the distinction between them again, or what's the problem?
The problem is that they can't, because they classify matter as innately evil.
Okay.
God couldn't make it. That's where we get Docetism from Dokain, to seem. Jesus seemed to have a body, but he couldn't have been. He must have been a phantom, because good, perfect Christ could never come into a material body because the body is evil. That sort of a thing. So there we have problems. The other issue is celibacy. And, all right, this is just absolutely huge, because what the Roman Church is they developed an apartheid system where the average Christian was supposed to get married and have all kinds of kids, but there was an innate, not innate, there was the sense that if you wanted to be in clergy, if you want to be holy, then you don't engage in sexual activity. You keep yourself from that, and so there's this defiling, and so they gave the impression that people who married were automatically defiled. They were automatically disqualified, and so you had this apartheid system set up, and unfortunately, you see, what was the first thing God did when He created man? What did He tell him?
Go for it.
Go and be fruitful.
That's right.
And multiply and fill the earth.
Yep. Exactly.
And that's good. That's what God wanted us to do. And so this cloud, but you see, this dualism creates this cloud. Oh, you know, I'm thinking about this. I'm a kid and I'm thinking about this. I'll never make the clergy. I'll never make the cut. I'm going to have to drop out and distance myself from God so that I can engage in the marriage and have kids.
Worldly, fleshly, mundane kind of thing.
Right.
I mean, you still feel the weight of this stigma.
Well, it's been carried through. The Reformers and the Protestants, they realized, well, you look at the behavior of the Roman Catholic clergy, and they didn't pull this off. They were,
of course not.
oh man,
not at
they
all.
were the most depraved people on the planet sometimes. There were some of them that were okay, but especially in the Middle Ages, it was pathetic. So they couldn't do it, but yet they were telling the people, this is what God wants for you if you really want to please God, you know. And so this is the Reformers and the Protestants said no. that is wrong. That's not what God wanted. But exactly, there is still this cloud, and that's why the Muslims don't see this dualistic issue. They think they're actually pleasing God by having a bunch of kids. What a concept! You see, they've turned away from God,
Yeah.
who is not a separate God from the Old and New Testament, and that's one of the issues, that we've got. And because that thinking that we've got this sterile God who's not even living. See, if you go to Plotinus's God, the Neoplatonic God,
Mm-hmm.
he can't know anything really about the world. He can't see anything. He
Uh-huh.
can't experience anything. He can't do anything. He's just like those carved images that the
Uh-huh.
prophets describe.
Yep.
They're setting them up
Yep.
based on reason, but they can't do anything.
I mean,
So their
this is.
followers,
Yeah.
it says those who make them will be like them. Well, that's exactly right. The people who follow this make-believe God of goodness can't judge anything. They can't distinguish between right and wrong, and that's why the followers that are followed after this God are so amoral. That's why they're so lawless. So that's kind of the discussion in a
Wow.
nutshell. If you looked at the book, I go into great detail. Not boring. I think it's interesting. I use bullet points a
Oh yeah.
lot to pull
Yeah.
people through some of these longer conversations. But
Right.
there's a real problem with the system. Now, not only is there a problem with the cosmology, there's a problem with the political systems as well. And because we walk through the book in history, then we take that up more when we get to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. Before we go there, if we could, I'd like to talk a little bit more about evolution and the duration of the age. If you're
Absolutely.
good with
Yeah.
that.
Let me just give a really quick, summary for those of us those that are watching that, this is a huge issue what Chris is bringing up here. I mean, it's sometimes we think, well, that was for people back then, or we're beyond all that, or modern Christianity is different. No, we are simply the child of all of these philosophies compounded upon one another. And while the modern evangelical movement has righted a few of the wrongs, we still are piggybacking on so many of these things. And what Chris is talking about here of this concept of lawlessness, it goes through and through and through. And not only do they want to be lawless toward certain gods, but lawless toward the most important God. All right, so I think this is a huge issue, and it's crazy, Chris. As I've done my research as well, you kind of just you get hit with like a ton of bricks. You're like, oh my goodness, this is so heavy, Or just even sometimes when I'm reading through the prophets and I see God discussing what has happened over the history of Israel, and I'm like, oh my, I just kind of start to feel this sense of, I know so little. I see how we have made God in our own image and in our own likeness instead of measuring up to His image and His likeness. So I think what you're doing is incredibly important because we really have made God in our own image. And despite some of the nice music nowadays, and there's lots of good songs out there that people sing, but you start thinking about the theology, and I'm like, the theology isn't that deep, right? And it really. And even when you start talking about Jesus, I mean, Jesus is basically this amazingly good guy. He taught us a couple cool things, but he was so nice that he decided to die for us. And that's basically where we leave him, and then we're done with him because he finished the law for us. None of that stuff applies to us anymore. And now we're on to this new prophet called Paul. But anyway, I digress. So please go on with the cosmology and evolution, etc.
All right. Whether someone out there is a believer in literal 6 days of creation, or you believe in a recently inhabited old earth, everybody has to agree something horrible happened to the planet. You've got it almost looks like a worn-out soccer ball turned inside out in some places. There are tectonic plates set on edge, some of them turned upside down. You've got ocean floors that are up on top of mountains. You've got fossils, the sea fossils, at 15,000 feet. You've got whale bones up in the mountains. You've got you've got all kinds of forests and vegetation trapped underground, what we call fossil fuels and that sort of thing. God could have created the world to look like it had gone through a beating, but we know that it did, and most geologists who are Christians agree that this took place during the flood. They also agree that what did this to the earth wasn't a bunch of rain. It wasn't a bunch of wind. It wasn't even a bunch of earthquakes. The earth got smacked with something big to do what it did to the earth. In fact, if you are familiar with Pangea, it really describes great. Peter does a great job of describing the earth before and after the flood, and he's describing it as standing out of water and in the water. And if you look at Pangea, I've got a picture of it I could put up for people to see if you thought it was necessary, but I think most people probably know what that looks like. All right, well, the asteroid situation, and Bennu has been in the news just lately, but I have several pages, a half a dozen pages, I think, or so, in the book talking about this. And why am I talking about this? Because God says I'm going to do a short work on the earth. I'm going to cut it short in righteousness. I think he means I'm going to cut it short because it's the right thing to do. God has set out, he's done a planting. When a farmer in the northern hemisphere, above the subtropics or whatever, plants a crop, they know that winter's coming. They're going to grow that crop, and then winter's coming, and that's going to be gone. And there's going to be a certain time for this thing to grow. And you even see that in Isaiah 28, where he talks about the calamity that's coming upon the earth. And then it even says, does the farmer go on plowing forever? Doesn't he till the earth, and plant the cumin and have it yield and the grain and the wheat and that sort of thing? And okay, so you've got some earth changes.
I just thought I'd just share that with everybody so they can just take a look at that really quick. So it kind of puts it in perspective in case people aren't up on what we're talking about here. But that's the basic idea of what Pangea is, or so basically this gigantic supercontinent. And then it all spread apart. It's interesting if you do take the position of Pangea. And for me, I've still been kind of undecided on this, but I'm very much open to it. But, it talks about back in the days of Peleg, before the earth was divided.
Right. Divided, yeah.
So, there's some suggestion that maybe the earth underwent some kind of a change there as well. So, but go on, please.
All right. Well, when scientists have gone out and put these big telescopes out in space, and they've got these big electron telescopes, and we're looking out in space, and as they've looked down into space, they haven't gotten a sense, well, everything's safe. Well, we don't really have to worry. We're just snug as a bug here. No, it's terrifying them. What they're seeing out there, the number of what they call near-Earth objects, and those are objects that rotate around the sun, and they come within the radius of the Earth's rotation and the sun. So they're constantly weaving in and out of there, kind of like in the destruction derby. And people may not be aware of this, but 48.5 tons of meteoritic material come into the Earth's atmosphere every day. There's that much stuff. That's why there's so much junk out there. You can't believe it. That's why you can look up at the stars on almost any night, and if you wait long enough, you're going to see one or two shooting stars. Well, what is that? Those are things that are big enough that they can light up, to where we can see them as they're coming into the atmosphere. And just a 7-meter asteroid has the same power as the little boy that was dropped on Hiroshima when it first hits the atmosphere. Some of these bigger things, it's pretty incredible. I'm going to give some statistics here. 2013, a 10,000-ton meteor about 17 meters came into the atmosphere. That's Chelyabinsk. And it blew out the windows in about 3,000 buildings, and people got hurt. That's a 17-meter. Okay. In 1908, in the Tunguska, I don't know if that's the way you pronounce that meteor that landed over in Russia, out in the woods, blew down 80 million trees. Okay, so I want to read you a little thing. Don't be bored. This is from Professor Nelson of Tulane University on meteorites, impacts, and mass extinction. And I'm not going to read it all, but he describes a large that is about a 400 to 500, a thing about the size of Bennu. In other words, it's about 1/3 of a mile. Well, that would actually, I think, pretty well destroy the Earth. I mean, this is smaller than that. These come through every once in a while. He said if one hit the Earth, we'd have an earthquake about 13 on the Richter scale. It would be felt all over the world. Dust would go up into the air, block the incoming sun. There'd be a state of continual darkness. It would diminish the ability for photosynthesis and plant life. Wow. Okay, then there'd be wildfires ignited by radiation from the fireball and the objects that blew apart, just like all those trees and all those windows and that sort of thing. If it hit the ocean, there would be a steam cloud with CO2. There would be initial global cooling, like a nuclear winter, but then there would be global heating for years. So the Earth would have the kind of heat maybe that's going on in the end times. Maybe those tribulation saints they're coming in and they're thirsty and they're parched, and they've come in from the heat. We don't know. Okay. Large amount of nitrous oxide combining with oxygen because of the shock wave, I guess, producing nitric acid rain. So that's going to get into all the water. It's going to contaminate all the water. Is this ringing a bell anywhere in scriptures?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Revelation chapter 8.
Oh, yeah,
the grass,
absolutely. Mm-hmm.
The sun, the darkness, the thing hitting land, the thing hitting the water. Mm-hmm. All the acid, the wormwood, and all of these things. I mean, I don't know if he meant to be describing what's there in Revelation chapter 8 and 9 or not, but it sure seems like it. Okay, now, 400-meter asteroid striking the Earth produces about 2,800 megatons of TNT equivalent. 2011, we had a 400-meter asteroid. Y55 passed within the moon's orbit in the Earth, because that's what this Bennu is going to be doing, and it comes by about every 6 years, it turns out. Okay, Purdue says, and Purdue said it would take it's about 100,000 years in between those. Now stick that in the back of your mind. The Bennu articles that have been coming out lately say it's about 135,000 years between those impacts. Okay. 2002, between 50 and 120 meteors passed between the moon and the Earth. 2 asteroids in 2012, 1 in 2013, all in the 35 to 45 meter range passed through that corridor. All right, let me just cut to the chase here. Once they've seen out in space, guess what's happened? Well, the NASA has 5 plans, I guess, the Near-Earth Objects, Catalina Sky Survey, Pan-STARR, Linear, Spacewatch, and NEOWISE, and they're all now looking at what's coming. And if you'll notice, they won't announce to the public that these things have gone by until usually 12 to 24 hours or 36 hours after they've actually gone by the earth. They don't want to tell anybody about them. But then they'll say, oh, by the way, 3 days ago, this passed by, Well, here's the deal. If you believe in a 6,000-year-old earth, the earth got smacked about a little over 4,000 years ago with something so big that if it hadn't been for God, 8 people wouldn't have made it through it.
Wow.
Okay, there's this wisdom that comes down through the days of Elijah, or that description, and we talked about that before, I think, the days in the wilderness or desolation, and then the days of wilderness or I'm sorry, the days of law or Torah or Elijah, and then the days of Messiah, 3 sets of about 2,000 years, and then the millennium comes. What's kind of interesting, because it was either Plato or Plotinus actually said there was going to be 1,000 years and then a judgment at the end. Where did they get that? Where did they get that? So people that think that the kingdom of man has been released by God to just go off and do whatever we want to, and that there is no harvest. The book of Enoch is a perfect example. If you read the book of Enoch, now personally for me, I didn't come away after reading the book of Enoch looking for giants or being afraid of giants. I saw the Lord in there, and I saw coming judgment, and I saw the need for righteousness. That's the gospel. It's the harvest of souls at the end of this age. This is what Daniel talked about. This is what Jesus talked about. This is even what Enoch was talking about, and he was writing this so there would be this sense of awareness that we need to live a holy life, that there's going to be this judgment at the end of the days. And people, even the church, have lost track of that. They've been caught up in this evolution idea that everything is just going and going and going, and we're just going to reach out and we're going to go to other planets and we're going to just whatever our heart desires. God has just let us go to do that because that's just kind of God He is. Well, that's not the God of the Bible. That is an argument, a philosophy, a philosophical system that opposes. It exalts itself against Christ. That's not the way we're supposed to think, you see. And so I'm not trying to be a fatalist. I'm trying to be a seasonalist. There's a season, and you need to know the seasons, and you need to understand that His kingdom is not of this world. It's about what's coming, and being found worthy of eternal life. That's what the gospel is all about, and people, even the church, has gotten caught up in this. So the book spends, I'd say, no more than 10 pages on this whole conversation, because I don't want to dwell on it. I don't dwell on the celestial orbs and describe what they are and who they're believed to be and what they're doing and that sort of thing either. So I don't want people to get the impression that I just go into these things, but in depth. But I do touch on them. It is interesting that Dios Pater, the term used for Jupiter, is even in the Bible, Judea, is the good Deus, or the basically the God of the air, the God of the daytime sky, and for that to be fair, for it to be He's having a good day. And that's the word that's used in the New Testament, and so we get hermeneutics. It's the same way from Mercury,
exactly.
and the messenger.
So the God of the Father God, as Deus Pater, That, I mean, do you believe that is Satan, or who would you suggest that that actually is?
Well, the ancient philosophers believed the divine mind emanated from Deus Pater,
Okay.
uh, Deo. Now, it gets kind of interesting. Even in the Bible, there's terminology that's used as the day star, till the day
Hmm.
star arises in your heart.
Right.
We have
Yeah.
phosphorus,
Yeah.
phosphorus,
Phosphoros. Yeah. Yeah.
right, as the light bringer. The
Lucifer. Right.
first star of the, well, it's actually used for,
Luciferos, literally.
yes,
But
yes,
yeah, whether that actually meant that from the
the bright
Greek
and
or the
morning
Hebrew,
star
yeah,
is, the Anatolians.
that's the
Uh,
Ben Shachar, the son of the dawn, Ben Shachar. His name in
right,
Hebrew is
right.
Hillel. I wrote a book, not a book, but I wrote a paper and I did a PowerPoint presentation on that. If people are interested, it's um, the angelic domain of the fall of Satan. So that's something you can check out. But go ahead.
All right. I am going to, I think, um, I'm going to put up, if that is all right, kind of the outline to the book, I think, here for a second, just so people can see what's discussed.
Well, yeah, that's awesome. I appreciate you doing that. And then, yeah, everyone, I really encourage you to get this book. Um, just to understand the foundations of where we are, to understand how we kind of got into this place. And I think
Mm.
Chris does an excellent job of putting it all together. But Chris, kind of bring it up to speed for us.
All
You've
right.
laid out a lot of the history. You've laid out that we can go way back and we can see this philosophy has been there for an awfully long time. But who cares? I mean, what does this have to do with us? What does it have to do with the future, the end times? I mean, we're not following these ways anymore. So, how
Okay.
is this at all relevant to us today?
All right. People are so absorbed with trying to identify the lawless one, you see, and they are not so absorbed understanding lawlessness and what it looks like and where it came from, you see. And there's going to be this huge deception at the end, and we see this lawlessness uh, increasing exponentially. And so my goal was to show people, because a lot of people have said, especially a couple years ago, all of a sudden everybody said, how did this happen? How in the world did we lose our country? How did we lose Europe and Western civilization? And they're trying to figure out what happened. And what I brought up last time is this action-reaction thing. The Roman Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire messed things up so badly that people didn't want to have church law, canon law anymore. People didn't want to, you see, because the Catholic Church tried to rule the state, it opened a can of worms then. And the
Mm-hmm.
other reaction is, okay, the state can rule the church.
Yeah. Okay.
You see,
Yeah.
it was the Roman Catholics that
Right.
blew it.
And
They
this
are
is
the ones that took the top off of this can of worms.
and it's the Hegelian dialectic that you talked about last time. That
Right.
you create a problem, you create a counter problem, and then you have a solution that comes out of that. So
You got a war of philosophies, and when you think of philosophy, you're not just talking about cosmology, like I said, you're talking about political science, and the examination then of what a democracy looks like, and then there's the social democracy, and so obviously people in power have picked up on this conversation, not really a conversation, really a war between truth and error that's going on, and they've sought to see how they could use it to either control the people or use it to start wars of
mm-hmm.
conflict, because okay,
Mm-hmm.
we're going to get half the people on this side, we're going to get half the people on this side, and we're going to stir everybody up all over the world and see what happens. Well, you know what's going to happen. But there's a great deal of control. Well, near the end of the book, and people may have seen the chapters that I have against the Lord and against His anointed one, and the nation's rage, and so that's really what it comes down to. Two things I want to bring out is the metaphysical. When you come to the end of metaphysics and cosmology, you have to ask yourself, who created this wherever we're going, if we reach a higher plane that we're supposed to be getting to. And these spiritualists, they have these crystals on their car, and then they also have a walking fish. They're evolutionists, and then they've got these crystals, the spiritual aspect.
Right.
Well, where did the spiritual plane come from? Colossians tells us that the Lord Jesus, He created the heavens and the earth. The Lord created the heavens and the earth. When you talk about a place that has dimensions where you can define where I stop and you start, there are boundaries, there are bodies, so to speak, as philosophically. Somebody had to make that. It just as it didn't evolve here, it didn't evolve in some other dimension either. So people who think that they can contact something out there that are evolutionists, where did that being come from? How did that? What do they think is going on there? Well, metaphysics is it has its own fatalistic end, because in the end, if you're relying on metaphysics, you're going to end up, as Mark Twain wrote about in The Mysterious Stranger, and I quote him in my book, floating out in nowhere in your own mind, kind of like in a space capsule. In fact, you could think of it as the outer darkness. If you did exist, after this life, and you haven't gone to the place that Christ has prepared for us, where are you? And can you contact other people? What makes that contact possible? How do you know where you stop when somebody else starts? There's got to be dimensionality. There has to be activity, which means there has to be a time. There has to be frames, so to speak.
Absolutely.
And so what I do in the book is I show how utterly ridiculous evolution and metaphysics are. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to sell the public metaphysics, and evolution at the same time, but they can never bring them together, because if they ever touch, people get it. And they say, wait a minute, this whole thing can't work. This is stupid. I'm believing in something that's just stupid. But nevertheless, they drive these two things. You can have your own virtual world. You can have your own virtual reality. They're leading people into this virtual never land, as if something exists there, you see, that's outside themselves. So they're holding the promise, the carrot, that there's something spiritual about that. But there's nothing. There's nothing there. That's the outer darkness. If people are watching and they're not believers, they need to understand this. The other thing is, yes, there does seem to be a systematic global plan that I've brought up to you before, and I have it in my book about Golitsyn, about Anatoly Golitsyn, and the perestroika deception, and the globalization. The KGB and the Communist Party didn't go out of business. They went underground. And their goal was to socialize Europe, socialize America. Then after they did that, they would try and get rid of NATO, and then they would bring back the class struggle conversation, because that was repulsive. It was repulsive, and people who were anti-communists always said, "Well, it's all about the struggle, the class struggle, and that's ridiculous." But they brought that conversation back, and then the last thing that happens is they reemerge then as a power base, as a weaponized power base reconfigured Eurasia. Well, he wrote about this in the 60s through the 80s, and said, here's what they're going to do. Here are the phases. He predicted. He said they're going to take down the Berlin Wall. They're going to, release Poland and satellite states. They're going to have the glasnost. They're going to dissolve the Soviet Union and look like it doesn't exist anymore. It's all in his book. It's just absolutely frightening to read it, because it's all happened exactly like he said it would happen. They would turn the people against their government. They would alienate the people from the government to make the people feel like the government wasn't on their side, that the government was working against them. Wow. It's all in his book. I mean, every place we are right now.
This is the perestroika deception, is that right?
The perestroika deception. And I have a summary at the end of the book, and it's kind of a bullet point summary. Here's what he said it was going to happen. He wrote 2 books. He wrote one that were letters to the CIA. He was trying to get them to inform the public. They wouldn't do it. He came up with his own book, was New Lies for Old. That wasn't received. Christopher Story got with him in 1984, I believe. They republished. And at that time, over 90% of the things that he said were going to happen when he first wrote the book had already happened. And now the dissolution of NATO is about the only thing left on the list.
Wow.
And he said once they do that, they just throw the net.
Oh my goodness.
And it's done.
What's the end goal here? I mean, it's done, and then
global communism, one world government. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, but the thing is, if you go back to, and here's another thing I do in the book, you see, because I go back to the peasant wars, which is really where individualism started out, and you've got that picked up. You've got Moses Hess, who was really the forerunner of pre-Zionism almost. Well, he's the guy that talked Friedrich Engels out of his salvation, basically. Engels wrote about the peasant wars and Munster's trying to set up a utopia. And it's interesting that Munster's banner was the rainbow flag. How about that?
Oh my goodness.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So that then you've got Marx. The thing about it is, if you've read the Communist Manifesto, you see that there's supposed to be a transition government to transitioning to where everybody is the state and the state is everybody. But there's got to be this intermediary government that's got to set this up to make it happen. Well, see, they always get in control, and then they never get out of control.
Right, of course.
And so the people running the Communist Party and the people who are in on this game, basically. Now, other people would say, oh, no, it's the Atlanticists, it's the Illuminati. I don't know what to tell you, except they may be 3, squirrels wrestling over a nut, or they could already have made their plan. They could be working together. They may already know one of them's going to come out as the top dog. And we just don't know.
And part of your point here is that, yes, there are conspiracies. They're very real. They're very well thought out. But, if the conspiracy is up here, there's still a whole nother level down here, is that man, by and large, has rejected God's kingdom and God's laws.
Yes, and what they're doing, what the people who may be conspiring, and it looks like they are, have just used these reactions and actions of men, and especially metaphysics, these 2 things, selling evolution, atheism, selling atheism, and at the same time selling yourself as God, selling metaphysics. But they can't put them together, but they're selling both of those to the people. And so when you go all the way back, as we've talked about before, the classical philosophers were seeking to hear from the divine mind. They were, to learn about the monad, to learn about the first principle, the first cause, and that sort of thing. They were seeking the nous through the mind of Jupiter. and they wanted to hear those voices from the celestial orbs, and I have that in the book. I have the Ptolemaic celestial orbs. They very much believed in that. They very much believed in the world soul, which we could think of today as Mother Earth, or ecology. You know, the green, you know, Mother Green, whatever you want to call her now. You know, that's a very real part of it. The soul, the world soul.
You know, I have a couple questions here from one from Samuel. He says, do we believe that the moral degradation of secular law is directly linked to the general abandoning of Yehovah in our culture? You get that question? So, do you and I believe the moral degradation of secular law is directly linked to the general abandoning of God or of Yehovah in our culture?
Yeah, we talked about this last week in the example of the flock of birds or the fish, school of fish. You know, when you untether from what is truth, because there is truth, and law. God is a God of government. He's a God of order, as Paul says. You know, let everything be done decently and in order. And so God is a God of order and peace and authority and submission. You see it over and over in the New Testament. It doesn't matter whether it's Paul or Peter. They're both stressing this, submitting to authority. And so it is two things. It's turning away from the laws of God, but it's also turning away from law altogether. See that the leaders of lawlessness want people to believe there's no rules, there's no fear, there's no consequences, and there shouldn't be an authority. They're selling that to the people. They want to. They're the authority, but they're trying to tell the people that so that there will be chaos.
Do you see this coming from the church at all? I mean, you know, I think that's something that we've kind of touched on, that the church is so drunk on this concept of grace, which you and I love grace.
Absolutely.
But we can't divorce it from God's laws. I mean, really, you know, to say that they're just to have a lawless attitude is really, it comes down to God's laws, because his are the only laws that matter.
Yes.
Right? I'm sure, you know, even Satan has his code of ethics.
Civil law matters too.
Yeah. Well, of course. But the only civil law that really matters is the stuff that's truly based on God's word.
Yeah, it's modeled after God's law. Yes.
If it's contrary to that, then it would need to be destroyed. For example, the woman's right to abort her baby, while that is a civil law, that's a very bad civil law, right? And that's something that needs to be overturned, even though it's legal within our system, and so is homosexual marriage legal within our system.
Yes.
But it's absolutely... it's lawless, you know, even though we've said it's lawful, but it's lawless is what it is. So, you know, I think that's kind of the point I'm getting at there. But
I think that answers their question. Should.
Yeah. Another question here. This is from George. He says it might be a silly question, but he says, is there any truth to Pythagoras being the first Freemason? Any thoughts on that?
I have no idea. You know, what I guess I would need to know how he was defining that, because I don't think that terminology existed back then. As far as, you know, being into numbers and shapes, a mathematician, that sort of thing.
That's what mathematicians do.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm a little skeptical of that myself, but anyway, all right, and then one more question from George. He says, do you think that America was founded on Platonic philosophy, pagan theology, or a mixture of both, and why?
Well, absolutely a mixture of both. I mean, you had colonies, you had settlements that were actually companies. You know, they were for-profit companies, and you had settlements that were Protestant settlements to worship freely and worshiped Jesus sincerely. And so basically you had a new land opened up, and you had people moving there for various reasons from various places. And so then they had to figure out who they were. And we had the Declaration of Independence, and then we had really two shots at the Constitution, and then we had the Bill of Rights, to try and refine that later on down the line. So, as I mentioned before, the colonies, when the Constitution was signed, were still supporting churches with tax dollars for the most part. So even though most people were deists, see, this is something that other than communist, other than the communists recently in the 19th century, 20th century. Atheism has never. There hasn't been atheism. People believed in some kind of God, and they, the states or the governments or the countries, whatever you want to call them, they belong to, had a state religion. That was just typical. That's why it asks in the Bible, has a nation ever changed their gods? No, it was unheard of. It was unheard of. But nations did have a god. They had the when the Assyrians, the Babylonians came over to Israel, they had to find out how to worship the god of the land. Remember?
That's right.
Because the land had a god.
That's right.
And so that was the belief. The land has a god, and so.
Which is absolutely true, right? I mean, Daniel chapter 10 underscores that fact that there's the Prince of Persia, there's the Prince of Greece. I mean, there are these angelic beings that the Bible calls watchers, and each one of them, the top dog, has his region, and he's ruling over that region. And God, Yehovah, is the one who was and is, of course, ruling over Israel, as well as the whole world, but that's another discussion. So, yeah, it's really true. And, yeah, what nation has ever changed their gods? Well, Israel decided we're going to do these other gods. It's crazy. Wow.
Okay, so I don't know if that answered the question. Obviously, there was a mix, and most people were at least deists, and they were mostly politicians, unfortunately, and that means you can find quotes by them fully supporting the Lord Jesus Christ in their faith, and you can find quotes by them that would be secular and denying the faith altogether. They were politicians, unfortunately.
Well, it does sound like a lot of how we have kind of the Sunday Christian mentality, right? That during the rest of the week, live any way you want, do anything you want, consume, stomach, mind, whatever. Anything you want, but but then on Sunday you suddenly get pious and you're all contrite and all this different stuff, so it's still alive and well, unfortunately. And I think it's just awesome. Tell us again, people can get this book at
Amazon and Nook and all those places. It's called The Rise of Western Lawlessness. But I wrote it originally, and I called it Dark Freedom. So the paperback is actually still Dark Freedom with the subtitle The Rise of Western Lawlessness if you want it in print. If you do get it in print, I would at least go online and look inside the book and read the preface, because the preface that's in the e-book is updated. So the book has been updated with the preface added. And by the way, I put the book on sale for 99 cents. It retails for $4.99. Wow. Okay, and I put it on sale for 99 cents because of this interview, and I'm going to run it through the 15th. So that way people that are watching this podcast and find out about it can still pick it up. And after the 15th, I'm going to bring the price back up again.
Yeah, and I just posted that in the chat box there. So guys, costs you $1, less than $1.
There's a lot of research in this thing.
Oh man, I mean, you're giving this away. I mean, when people begin to understand that all these things, not only does it cost money to write the book, but then you got all the maintenance of actually getting it out there. So it'd be fantastic. I hope you have a chance to look at that. You're inspiring me to put my book on sale as well, and I need to send you this, Chris. Okay. So this is Discovering the Language of Jesus, all right?
Okay.
And I make the argument that Jesus, the disciples, everybody in Israel in the first century knew and spoke Hebrew. Okay. Now I'm not saying that they didn't know Greek, because I think they did know Greek.
Yeah.
All right. But but their mother tongue was Hebrew. And if you go to
Actually,
Israel,
yeah, even the Latin church fathers were required to use Greek, and primarily wrote in Greek.
well, and Jerome learned Hebrew, right, because he wanted to know the
Right.
Bible. But
Right.
it's okay. We'll debate this on another time. We'll have you on. We can debate this. This will be fun.
No.
It's a fun discussion. I mean, it's not a debate. It's a discussion.
No,
Right?
I love
So,
the Hebrew
yeah.
language, and I love the the meaning of the characters, and it's so rich, and it I think it's the original language.
Yeah. So somebody said thank you for sharing your book, for making it available for 99 cents. That's really awesome. Excuse me. So yeah, Chris, I wanna just thank you for coming on this show tonight. It's been, again, another pleasure. You are such a wealth of information, and I really like. But what I love is to get down to the very foundation of things, and I feel like so often we're shooting at the symptoms. We're discussing the symptoms. I mean, okay, I have a headache, or I hear some aspirin. Well, that's fine. It's a momentary relief, but why do you have a headache? And I think that's what we're trying to get at. What is causing this, right? So there's cause and there's effect. There's cause and effect, and I think we in modern evangelical Christianity have gotten all wrapped up into the symptoms or the effects of the end times, and we're excited about that. We'd love to talk about the technology. We like to talk about the rise of the Antichrist. Is he going to be from Italy? Is he going to be from or Rome specifically, or from Europe, or is he going to be a Muslim type Antichrist? Is he going to come from Turkey? Those are all symptoms, you guys.
Yeah,
right?
There can be a lot of distractions.
Yeah,
too. And it's okay to look at those other things after you have looked at the foundational issues.
Exactly. And I found myself getting kind of sucked into the whole thing of the conspiracies, which I believe probably most of them are true. 9/11, et cetera, right? And you can get into the whole.
Go down the list, yeah.
Oh yeah, and the Federal Reserve, and all this different stuff, and you're like, oh my goodness, right? You're it's like you're deer in the headlights, right? You're like, oh, it's crazy, drinking from a fire hose. But then I began to realize that just studying the conspiracies, it had no fruit, it had no end, it had no solution. Okay, and then. And I'm like, okay, that's all interesting stuff. It's all true, probably, a lot of it. But what can I do with it? And so what I wanted to get down to is even more of the bedrock. And that's what I feel like you've done in your book. That's definitely on my heart as well, is to get right down to the bedrock. Why are all these things happening? And, God made promises that to Israel. He said, if you will follow my ways, then none of the plagues will come upon you. But if you abandon my ways, my law, what is reality, if you abandon that, then all the plagues that came upon Egypt and others will come upon you. And I don't think that Israel is the only example. I think they might be special in some ways, but those are general truths. And see, here's something that people need to understand, Chris, is that God did not create the law and say, oh, here you go. Okay, it's not like he wrote a book, right? But like when you wrote your book, you were simply collecting data that was already there. When God gave the law, he wasn't giving these brand new ideas. He said, I just cooked these up. They're fresh out of the oven. Here you go, right? No, he was giving the insider's guide to how the world works. And he says, look, this is how the world works. This is how my universe works, right? And if you are in harmony with these laws that are immutable, incontrovertible, irrevocable, if you are in harmony with those, in other words, you keep them, then you will enjoy a good life. But if you are in disharmony with those, and you violate those, and you break those, then you will experience pain at some level. And for me, that's kind of the most foundational kind of thing that we have, is that if we'll just go along with what God has revealed as to how his universe works, then we're going to have a better life. Okay, maybe not perfect, but certainly a better life. Versus if we violate those willingly, knowingly, even unwillingly and unknowingly, if we're violating the laws, you can. I mean, these guys playing Pokemon, right? I mean, a few of them have fallen off cliffs. They've got hit by a car. They didn't mean to. They didn't know that they were walking off a cliff, but they still walked off the cliff, right? And if you walk off the cliff, you're still going to die. It doesn't matter whether you meant to or not, right? And so if we break God's laws, even unwittingly, you're still going to face the consequence, because that's just how life is. And so, again, really appreciate it. It's awesome. People are just really excited that you were here this evening. And again, thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
So,
Absolute pleasure.
Well, everyone, thank you for tuning in to the Awakening Report. It's always great to have you guys with us. Keep reading your Bible, because that is our source of truth, all right? And it's going to help you get through this life. So follow God's ways. They're the best way to go. Until next time, God bless.
I want to thank everybody for watching the Awakening Report. John sent me a message, so I'm going to stop in and give you guys an update. The upload to YouTube will be done by 10 Central Time. David Carrico's Exposing the Darkness Conference will be up by 10 Central Time, so check it out. You guys, everybody in the chat room is just, the whole evening was just a discussion of what you guys were talking about. Great show. Thank you guys. Thank you for watching your Awakening Report. We'll say shalom.
Shalom.